get started, but hi, my name is Lotus or Sam. I run Cosmo Cosplay, so I'm a fursuit maker, I draw, I cosplay, I kind of do a little bit of everything. But this is going to be my Fursuit Making 101 panel. I've held this panel a couple times at conventions in the past, Anthrocon, MCFC, MFF, so if you've been to it before, welcome. This is a lot of the same information, but it's still very helpful. So yeah, this is Fursuit Making 101, but it's going to cover a lot of topics. It can also help for cosplay and just general costume design or building. So, included in this panel, I'm going to do a little bit about me, because I feel like it's always important to hear about the person that's speaking to you. You know, you want to see my artwork and prove that the things I'm telling you are actually used. But we'll be covering sewing basics, fabrics, smart shopping, common tools, working with Warpla, mold making, 3D printing and or modeling, foam work, patterning, safety, social links, and then a Q&A. And so, about me, I'm 22. I've been doing costume design for about 11 years now, and I just want to tell all of you I have two of the cutest dogs. So I know everyone always says, oh, my dog is the cutest dog. No. My dogs are the cutest dogs. Thank you. Yes. So the orange dog, that's Cosmel, hence Cosmo Cosplay. So kind of designed my brand around her, and I've got my little mini Cosmel with me, so she's here to help. But my other puppy is Cashew. And so my story, I started making suits in around 2010 or 2011. I started taking art commissions, or rather fursuit commissions, in 2016. I had my LLC officiated in 2018. So raise of hands, who was at my business panel yesterday? Was anyone? Yeah, so thank you guys for coming back. But we all had the pandemic or the panini in 2019. And then I started officially convention dealing in 2021. So a little bit about my suits. I started again in about 2011. So you can see my first suit there. I made that when I was about 10. And here's the new Lotus, who I just finished a couple months ago. But I always love to show this off because it shows that we all start somewhere, and not everyone starts out making, perfectly complex fursuits. We all have our first suit that we always cherish and love, but it's good to see growth within art. And here's Lotus. So she's had about 5 renditions now. So again, just to show that we all don't start out with great skills. You can see 2014 Lotus, 2016, 2018. So mind you, I made 2014 Lotus when I was about 13, so she's been through the ringer, and now she's at 2021 and 2022 versions. And so just to show off a couple of the other suits that I've made, I want to say I've made 31 suits now, so it definitely takes a lot of time, dedication, and practice to continue to increase your skill. And here's a little bit of my other work. So I don't just do fursuits. I like to do cosplay. I do hooves, for Renfest and things like that. So I'm kind of all over it, but I enjoy mainly costume design. So we're going to start off with some sewing basics. As a raise of hands, who's sewn anything before? Yeah, so that's most of you. So see, that's awesome. You're all like 2 steps ahead already, which is perfect. So this is, again, just some really basic things, but so when it comes to sewing, who's sewn fur? I know it's a little bit different. So again, most of you have, which is great. So something that maybe some other people don't know is when you're sewing fur or fursuits, you want to sew them inside out. Same goes for most other fabrics, but with fur, that's really going to give you clean seams and it's going to hide your stitches. So always, as much as fabric is important, thread is equally as important. So you're going to want to make sure that you use a nice sturdy thread. I love Gutermann, that's my favorite. I use a polyester thread instead of a cotton because things like cotton tend to rip and they're almost weaker than the fabric that you're using, so your seams can pop super easy. And I always say to stay away from embroidery threads just because those tend to be more decorative threads than like sturdy. I've also used like paracord thread in the past before, and I personally use that to sew on my necks and things like that, like super high tension areas. And here's my amazing illustration on how to thread a needle. So it'd be so much easier if I could do like a hands-on tutorial for you guys. And one day, I hope that can be like a goal to do like a hands-on how to make fursuits panel. But for now, we've got this illustration. And so I always say, this is not going to teach you how to thread a needle. I recommend looking at a YouTube video or something like that so we can show you. But it's pretty simple. I always use a double-threaded needle. So you're going to want to take the thread, loop one end through the needle, take the ends together and tie a knot. I usually double or triple tie my knots. And then here's a couple of basic stitches. So the one that I probably use the most is a blanket stitch. It tends to be the sturdiest in my opinion, and it's just the most versatile for what I do. But people also like to use back stitches, which are also great. Or I personally like invisible stitches. If you have, for example, here, let me stand up and not knock everything over. But for example, on my suits, when I make them, the face piece and the back of the head are essentially two pieces that come together in the end. And so I do an invisible stitch along the ears to hide that seam. And so that's not something that I can sew inside out. So I just glue her face and then glue the back of her head on, and then I do an invisible stitch this way. That just tends to be the easiest way for me to do it, and I like the outcome, so I stick with that. But out of everyone that's sewn, has anyone used a sewing machine? Yeah, so a lot of you too, that's pretty good. So my favorite brand, it's kind of like cameras too. Everyone has their like preferred brand, or like Apple versus Samsung. I'm a Singer girl. I like Singer. They've been good to me. I haven't had any issues. But I know my friend uses Brother. I've seen some people with some nice Viking machines. So they all work good. It's just about finding what works with you. And so now we're going to get into fabrics. So there is a ton of different fabrics that you can use for fursuit making. You are not limited to these at all. But these are just some basic ones that I like to use. So who has bought like fake fur in the past? A lot of you. So I'm sure you know there's a bunch of different like types of fake fur. And some are definitely higher quality than others. I believe I will be getting into, in the next couple slides I'll be getting more into fur, but we're going to start out with minky. So, does anyone know what minky is? Yes? Yeah, so minky is a shorter pile fabric. And what I mean by pile is like the length of the fiber. And I'll get more into that when I get to fur. But minky is a no stretch fabric, meaning if you do stretch it, it will pull, but it will not bounce back. It's great for paw pads, noses, tongues, and mouths. So up on Lotus here, I know you can't really see from far away, but her nose is minky, her tongue is minky, the inside of her mouth is minky, and so are her ears. And so I like that for like a soft detail on suits. It kind of breaks it up from just being all fur. And now we'll get into types of faux fur. So there's bunny shag, luxe shag, which is like the most common, long pile, and then monster and or like Mongolian. I know there's a couple other that I've seen on Howl Fabrics as well. I want to say it's like Flow Kit or something like that, but that's like the super long fur, like up her head. But so bunny shag is a super short but dense pile fur, so it's usually about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. And it's great for details, or I use it on like the sleeves of my bodysuit, again, just to break up the different fur lengths. But I like that one. It's, again, one of the highest quality furs in my opinion, just because it is so dense. So then there's also luxe shag. Luxe shag is like your basic fursuit fur, in my opinion, I'd call it that. Pretty much every fursuit has luxe shag. That's like the classic, shaggy dog type fur, just your basic run-of-the-line fursuit fur. It always tends to be about 1 inch in pile length, but sometimes it is about 1.5 inches. It just kind of depends. My favorite part about luxe shag is that it can be shaved down, and that's something that not many people kind of realize about fursuits, but Lotus's fur on her face was at one point luxe shag, it's been shaved down a bunch. And I will touch on shaving later as well. Then moving on to long pile. Long pile fur tends to be more of like a detail type fur. You usually can't shave it down because it has a very thin like pile count. Usually if you look at like a longer shag fur, if you like search between fibers, you can see the backing and things like that. So that's why I don't recommend shaving it. It's great for details though. I know I have it on like the back of my tail, so you see like that nice flow, like that's what people want with long pile, versus the rest is luxe. And so you can see that it really doesn't move as much as the white long pile does. And then monster or Mongolian fur, that's usually 2 inches or more in length. Same with long pile can be longer, but the thing that differentiates monster and long pile is that monster fur is usually kind of like wavy. I don't really know why it is, but it is. I don't personally love to use it a lot just because it clumps and it tends to be a little bit messier than other long piles, but I have seen people use it for different furs or different fur textures. Like, I know there's a sheep that I've seen before that used long pile, or monster or Mongolian fur, and it looked great because it gave like the big sheep vibe. But, okay, faux fur and fursuit tips. So, who knows about like the direction on fabrics? Yeah. So that's kind of an easy one once you can pick up on it. But every fur does have a direction. So again, with my tail here, you can see that this long pile really wants to go down like this. Wow, I know. So you wouldn't want to cut this fur so that it's going the other way. You know, you wouldn't want, I'm sorry, I'm just pulling this tail around my body, but you wouldn't want it to be going up because then it's not going to flow down. But that's very important to check on suits and fur before you even pattern it. Just some more basics. I like to cut my fur with a utility knife or blade, just because when you're cutting with scissors, you have the chance of cutting the pile, because you want to be cutting it from the back. I should have started with that, I'm so sorry. So when you cut fur, you do cut it from the back. That way you can draw your patterns on it and things like that without messing up the pile or the front of the fur. And so when you're cutting it, I like to cut it with a utility knife or blade, just because that way you won't cut the pile. And if you're using scissors, you're going to be cutting straight through all of those fibers. That's not what you want to do. And then I always say when you are working with fursuits, I don't like to line my suits with like a thick, warm fabric. You know, how many of you have worn a fursuit before? Yeah, so you guys know how hot it gets and it's sweaty in there, so you don't want to make yourself more warm. So I always line my fursuits with like a performance fabric or something like that. I personally line my suits with again, performance fabric that I get on Spoonflower. It's a polyester blend, but if anyone's ever worn like the Under Armour shirts or things like that, the really breezy fabric, essentially that. When working with fursuits as well, I always say test your patterns on a cheaper fur or something like that. You don't want to take your expensive $40 a yard fabric and test something brand new on that just in case it doesn't work out. So I always test my patterns on either a cheaper fur that's maybe been damaged, or I've even tested on things like fleece before if I just want to see how a pattern will fit. And then I mentioned pile a little bit earlier, and so we're going to get into that here, but there is a difference between high quality and low quality furs. So I prefer to get my higher quality furs from Howl Fabrics. I like Big Z Fabrics. Fursuit Supplies can have some nicer furs versus things like Joann's or Michael's. And it's one of those things that you can't really tell the difference until you're up close and you feel it. Because when you feel the fur that comes from Joann's, like that craft fur, it feels almost plasticky, and it's almost wispy when you look at it in person. It's hard to describe again without seeing it up close, but when you feel a higher quality fur, it's generally very soft and dense and nicer overall, plus it lasts. And so generally higher quality furs also have a higher pile count. So again, this is a horrible way to describe it without more pictures, but pile count can be described as in a square inch of fabric, how many fibers are there? So a higher pile count fur will have a more dense, feel to it, versus a low pile count will be super thin. And then neoprene or scuba. Does anyone know what neoprene is? Yeah, so we got a couple hands. So neoprene or scuba fabric is great for other details on suits. Like I like to use it for my teeth. I've seen people use it for their tongues or their paw pads. It really just depends on what you want to use it for and what look you're going for. It's very stretchy, but it's denser or thicker than spandex, and that's why I like it.
Good.
And we're good to go. Okay. So neoprene, again, great. I use it more for like details, things like that. But we'll get into smart shopping. Okay, so smart shopping is, in my opinion, one of the easier topics we're going to go over. It's kind of a given, but buying in bulk and things like that is always a great way to save money, because when you're buying, let's say, a yard of fabric, you're not only buying that fabric, but you're paying for shipping, which might be an extra, $15, $20, things like that, versus when you're buying 10 yards of fabric, you're going to pay maybe $60 in shipping. So the shipping price is smaller in the long run per yard when you buy more at once. So I know whenever I buy fabric, granted, I'm a fursuit maker, so I have the room and storage for more fur, but I always buy, 10 yards of white fur at once versus, a yard for this suit and a yard for that suit, and that usually saves money in the long run. And then when you do buy more fur like that, you're going to be saving fabric in a sense, because then you won't have the hard cut lines per yard, so you can nestle your patterns in there better and save more fabric in the long run. Online apps like Honey are great for saving money on fursuits or fursuit parts, things like that. Rather not fursuits themselves, but the parts for your fursuit. And so I know when I bought my 3D printer or things like that, I was able to find some coupon codes and save some money. Again, ship everything at once, or if you can pick things up in person instead of shipping them, that always helps. And now we'll get into tools. So, do you guys recognize most of those tools up there? Maybe. Some look unfamiliar, yeah. So we'll get into them. So, my must-have tools, this is kind of like the basics to fursuit making, is a glue gun, sewing machine, which you don't need. I know plenty of fursuit makers that don't use sewing machines, and that's perfectly fine, but this is my personal must-have list. A utility knife, Sharpies, or chalk. Chalk is great for drawing on black or darker fabrics, because a Sharpie, things like that won't show up. Or metallic Sharpies work great. You can use a measuring tape, needles and thread, sewing clips, and a seam ripper. I love sewing clips because they are, in my opinion, easier to work with and quicker to work with than pins. And plus, if someone finds a sewing clip in their fursuit, it is not a big deal at all, because that can't hurt you, it can't poke you, versus a needle. It's easy to lose needles in suits and things like that. So I personally, knock on wood, I haven't left a needle in a suit, but I don't even want to think about it, so I just use sewing clips. Those are great. And a seam ripper. Seam rippers are great, even for the advanced fursuit makers, we all make mistakes, and sometimes you gotta undo a seam or two. So, some of my more advanced tools are a serger, which is essentially a fancy sewing machine. It does finishing stitches, and I use it for my bodysuits and things like that. It's just going to be a higher quality stitch. Usually it's a zigzag. Most sewing machines can also do a serging stitch, so you don't need a whole individual machine for that, but I wanted to get one, so I did. A 3D printer is great. I personally 3D print my head bases, and so essentially what I do, we'll get into 3D printing later, but yeah, I'll just wait for that then. But also a belt sander, I use that a lot for my cosplay things, but I have used it for fursuit parts in the past. If you ever need to get something sanded super flat quickly, right? A soldering iron can also be used for fursuits or cosplay. If you ever see those suits with the cool LED eyes or maybe light up teeth, something like that, soldering iron comes in hand. A Dremel. Does anyone know what a Dremel is or has used one? Okay, most of you, again, that's great. So a Dremel is essentially a power tool that you can change the tip on. It's an oscillating tool. I think I'm saying that right. Either way, so that's great. I use that all the time. Like for my eye blanks, for example, I cast them out of resin, so I have to clean them up every time, so that's perfect. Or a heat gun. I use a heat gun if you ever have to warp a 3D print or Warbla or anything like that. And so here's some handy-dandy pictures of everything. So again, a serger looks similar to a sewing machine, but it generally has more needles and more thread. That 3D printer up there was my first one. I had an Annette A8. It was kind of one of those DIY build-it-yourself 3D printers. It was great for starting to learn, but I got a newer one, which we'll talk about here in a moment. There's a belt sander, soldering iron, and a Dremel. So, my tools. I use a Singer sewing machine 1507. I've had that bad boy since I was 10, and they say, you know, oh, things aren't built like they used to be, and I truly believe that. My sewing machine is a trooper. It's lasted me quite literally 31 plus fursuits. I know some of the newer sewing machines tend to break a lot easier. You have a question? Yeah.
Is there like sewing machine repair pieces?
Yes, there are. And so what I always recommend people too is if you're looking to buy a sewing machine, buy, you know, a refurbed older machine, because generally those are going to last longer and be hardier than the newer ones. Because the newer ones are, it's hard to describe, they're generally more plasticky and just the parts aren't as well built and things like that. And I know that makes me sound like an old woman to be like, my old sewing machine, but it's the truth. My old machine is great, I love it. My serger is a Singer Pro Finish serger. I've had that for maybe 3 years, and I don't use that as much as my regular sewing machine, but I haven't had any issues with that either, so I recommend that as well. My Dremel is a Dremel 3000. There's a bunch of different Dremel machines. In my opinion, they all work pretty much the same. It just depends if you want a wireless one, or corded, or higher horsepower, things like that. My clippers that I use for my fursuits are Andis BGRC clippers. I don't know the blade name off the top of my head, but I know I use a 3.2 millimeter blade for like the finishing shave on my fursuits. I want to say it's like a 4C of the Andis blades, not 100%. But I know I also use a 6.3 millimeter clipper blade, which is great. I always say when it comes to investing in your fursuit making supplies, in my opinion, a clipper blade is the most important thing. You know, you can sew your fursuit together any which way, you can glue it down, but the finishing shave, in my opinion, is a real defining feature on a clean fursuit. So my clippers were about $150, which I know is a lot for most people, and it was definitely a business investment, but I have had them for maybe 3 years now. Granted, you know, I've had to sharpen my blades or get new blades, but the clippers themselves are super sturdy and I love them. And then I currently have a Sidewinder X1. That's an artillery 3D printer. It's got a 12 by 12 inch build plate. It's given me, you know, a couple issues, as all 3D printers do. See, does anyone have a 3D printer? Yeah, so you guys know how testy they get, and if the temperature's wrong or something like that, they throw a fit. So I've had good luck overall with my Sidewinder, and I like it for its size, and it was pretty good for the price. I think it was about $400, so I recommend that. Okay, and now we're going to be working with Warpla. Show of hands, who knows what Warpla is? Ooh, we've got one person, so it's just you and me, we know what Warpla is, but Warpla is a thermoplastic. See, now does anyone know what a thermoplastic is? Okay, a couple more. So a thermoplastic is essentially a plastic that can be heated up, molded, and then when it cools, it retains the new molded shape. So this is used more so in cosplay, but I have found it handy for resin hinged fursuit heads in the past. Or you know, you can make your fursuit eyes out of Warpla, or your teeth, you know, you could really do anything with it, but I think it's important to learn about it. Warpla is, again, a thermoplastic. It's very forgiving. There's 3 different types. I prefer the Warpla Black Art. That tends to be the most forgiving and the easiest to smooth down. But there's also transparent Warpla and Warpla's Finest Art. I haven't personally worked with the Finest Art, again, because Warpla Black Art works for me, so I stick with that. And so, how do you use Warpla? Well, you're going to need your heat gun, your gloves, and a heat-resistant surface. You know, you're not going to want to do this on your mom's kitchen table and things like that, just because using that heat gun will really heat up whatever surface you're on. You want to make sure that you're safe and you don't burn your skin. So whenever you heat it up, it'll become malleable. And so you can heat it up a little bit and keep it kind of sturdy, or you can heat it up a lot. It's not going to really I'm sure to a certain degree it'd get liquidized and melt, but from what I have experienced, it hasn't like melted on me, but you just kind of apply as much heat as you need and you go from there. So you can see some of my cosplay stuff here, but Worbla is commonly used for like props or armor. You see some fancy fursuits out there that might have like a sword and a shield and like Renaissance Festival costume. So some of those fursuits might be using Worbla to make their costumes. Worbla can also be used to stabilize foam. And when I say foam, I'm not really talking fursuit foam. I'm talking more so like, I forget what the foam type is called. It's going to be in my next slides, but it's the pink insulation foam. That's what it is, I remembered. But it's usually used to stabilize that. You can sculpt with it. It can be painted. Generally for painting Worbla, I always cover it with gesso first. Does everyone know what gesso is? No. Okay, gesso is a painting material. Generally, artists use gesso to cover their canvases before they start painting. Yep, and so gesso smoothes out a canvas, or in this case, a Worbla prop, things like that. So it's just kind of a smoothing agent, we'll say it that way. So you apply that, and then you paint, and then you apply a top coat. And so you can see in my top picture there, you might not be able to tell from far away, but do you guys see the googly eyes on there? Maybe. There are googly eyes, I promise, those little white dots, but a fun little just tidbit that I love for armor making is googly eyes are perfect rivets, because you can apply those down, it's going to be a perfect little domed surface, and once you paint it over, it's going to look just like a little rivet. So that's what those were for. So some more Worbla tips. It sticks to itself when it's hot, and that's like the best part about it, so you don't really need any glue when you're working just with Worbla. For thicker armor, I like to make a Worbla foamy sandwich. And so what a foamy is, it's that super thin craft foam. Generally, you'll find it at like Joann's or Michael's, and it's probably about like a paper-sized sheet of it. Super thin, if you pull it on it, it'll rip. So it's kind of like a weaker foam, but you can cover that in Worbla and it's gonna like bulk it up. So that's a fun little tip. Again, always work with gloves on. You want to protect your money makers here. You can't work if you burn your hands, so keep yourself safe and make sure whatever surface you're working on is heat resistant. I usually use like a plastic mat or something like that, or like my personal work tables are so gross from working on fursuits for so many years. There's so much glue buildup and paint and all that stuff, so I don't care if those surfaces get more damaged, so I just work right on there. The fun part about Worbla sticking to itself is you don't want to throw away your scraps, because those can all just be molded together and you can roll it into a ball. I've seen people use a work-designated rolling pin to kind of roll out their Worbla scraps and make it flat again. Now we're going to get into 3D printing and modeling. So I personally am an iPad baby. I cannot switch over to like using my mouse and drawing on the computer or like those fancy tablets. I'm an iPad baby. I draw right on my iPad, and it's my friend and I's favorite joke to just call ourselves iPad babies because we don't go anywhere without them now. So I like to sculpt on my iPad. I personally use Nomad Sculpt. That's the one that I use the most, but I've also used Shaper 3D and Forger. I haven't used Forger a ton on the iPad. That's more of a modeling software than sculpting. And so who knows the difference between modeling and like sculpting? A little bit. So for the most part, modeling is going to be like, oh, I'm building a model airplane. It's a specific shape. It's generally like measured out, things like that. Or for a simplified version, a perfect rectangle. Something that you want dimensions on and it's going to be perfect. Versus sculpting is more so fluid. You're going to start usually with an orb. You can push the clay in, pull it out, get an organic shape. So you can see a little bit of my 3D modeling designs on there. Currently, all of my fursuit heads, for the most part, are 3D printed and modeled. And so what I do is, you can see that one head on there. I model that. I take an inverse of that model, so you're going to get like a hollowed out version, and I print a mold. So one way you could do it is you could directly print that 3D head, cover that silicone, make a mold that way. But I find it to be a lot easier and less time consuming to just make an inverse of the head and print a specific mold. I don't have any pictures in my slides. I should have included them, but all of my head molds. It's essentially a two-piece mold that's 3D printed. I smooth the inside down, like sand it down, whatever, and then I put a mold release on it, and then I use a liquid foam, which I will go over later in the slides, to cast all of my heads. So I do occasionally like foam sculpt my head bases if someone wants something a little more specific or unique, but for the most part, all of my heads are foam casted, which has saved me a bunch of time. Like in the past, I believe, like hand sculpting a foam head would take me, 8 to 10 hours, things like that, versus now I can cast a head in about 45 minutes. So it's increased my work speed a lot. And one thing that I love about it is all my heads are now perfectly symmetrical, and they all have like their Cosmo cosplay shape. So like if you're looking on my banner right here, you can kind of see like, oh, you can tell like that's a Cosmo cosplay head. Like my canines kind of look the same, things like that. So consistency was something that I really wanted to see with 3D printing. But I know I've also 3D printed, for example, Lotus's eyes. Her eyes are 3D printed. I've 3D printed Fursuit teeth. I don't know if anyone has seen my Doberman head in the dealer's den, but that one, all of his teeth are 3D printed. And so I just love the consistency, again, that 3D printing can bring. So you can see my amazing diagram here, but essentially my 3D files are going to be pulled off my iPad into Cura. Cura is a slicing program for 3D prints. So if you guys don't really grasp the 3D printing terms I'm using or things like that, I highly recommend some YouTube videos because I wish I had more time to cover 3D printing itself, but I really don't. And it's such a complex process that really takes more learning than a hour-long panel. So again, I go iPad to Cura, which is my slicing program, down to my 3D printer. So I use Hatchbox PLA. It's my favorite type of filament. There's PLA filament and ABS, and I'm sure there's some other ones out there, but Hatchbox has worked for me, so I like that. And here's some amazing 3D printed examples. Again, for the most part, it's all like cosplay stuff. So who plays Overwatch or has? Yeah, so I did a Devil Mercy cosplay. So again, I've mentioned that I do cosplay. I compete in my free time. Can't really make a ton of money off cosplay, so again, I just do that for fun, but Fursuit Making is my main income. But you can also see, like, I printed a skull mask for a Renaissance festival, and you can see those shoes. I'm sure it's hard to see from so far away, but those were part of my senior portfolio in high school. And so those shoes are, in my opinion, unique. Some people might find them gross, but I 3D printed teeth to put on the bottom of the shoe, just because I was into, like, unique design and things like that. But it just kind of goes to show that 3D printers can be for a wide range of things. And now we're going to get into foam work. And so you can see here that I guess on y'all's furthest to the left, those two foam heads, those were made out of my 3D printed casted heads, and same with those eyes. Whereas those toes and that nose, I had sculpted by hand out of clay and then molded, which we'll get into mold making as well. So types of foam, there's upholstery foam, that is your general fursuit foam. Some people have it in green, I've seen it in blue, I've seen it in black before, which is very interesting, but I'm sure everyone kind of can recognize that fursuit foam. It's got a good squish, but it's not like a memory foam, it's one of those things that in the future of this panel, I'll hope to have like a basket of little like interactive things for you guys to see. But there's also EVA foam. Does anyone know what EVA foam is? Yeah, so a good bit of you. EVA foam is generally a cosplay foam, but people can use it for fursuits as well. I've seen people make, like, I'm going to call it this, I don't know if there's a specific term, but like shell fursuit heads, in the sense of they're making a mold of a fursuit head that's hollow. I'm sure there's a specific term out there for it. I've never personally done it, but I've seen people do it in the past. Again, foamies that I mentioned previously, that's super thin, kind of like cheaper foam. There's also liquid foam, which I like, again, for mold making and things like that. And then insulation foam. Insulation foam is, again, great for cosplay. I wouldn't recommend it for fursuits because it is super brittle, but I think yeah, we're going to go over all the foams again. I know I just belted through all of them. I forgot I had individual slides. But again, upholstery foam, common fursuit foam, as I already said. You guys can tell that I know my slides because I did it without even looking at them. but it's easy to cut with an X-Acto blade or scissors. It works great with hot glue. That's why it's great, again, for fursuit making. A couple downsides about it is it does retain moisture. You can get it to dry out, but that's why I never recommend, fully submerging your fursuit heads or things like that. Like topical cleaning, great, but I wouldn't want to get a ton of moisture within the foam because you can get it to dry out, but it's going to take a lot of time and it might be subject to molding. So I'd be really careful with that. And it does bounce back. That's the best part about it. So for the most part, Lotus here, one of her ears has metal in it, and I forget which one, because it's like a posable one, it's this one. But this one is all upholstery foam. So the best part about it is I can like take her ear and I can really scrunch it up and it's gonna bounce right back. So that's the best part about it. But you wouldn't want to leave your fursuit head cramped for probably more than like 24 hours or things like that, just because the foam will only bounce back so much. So if you keep it scrunched forever, it's going to kind of crinkle and won't come back the way you want it to. So EVA foam, again, is great for cosplay. It's more of a cosplay foam than it is for fursuit making. It's usually a thinner, dense celled foam. So when I say cell, that's like the bubbles in the foam. It's very fine bubbles, it's very dense. It doesn't usually squish as much as like fursuit foam does. It can be sanded, which is interesting because it is so dense. If you use your Dremel, you can kind of like make a beveled edge and things like that. Just looking at my notes here, it can be trickier to work with, and it's kind of more of like a perfectionist foam in the sense of when you're gluing it together, it's going to show every little error you make, but it's very like gratifying once you are able to work with it because it's going to look super clean and fine. And so again with EVA, mentioning those imperfections, EVA foam cracks and or dents can be filled with things like quick seal caulk, and so that is, it's mainly used, for like sealing your bathroom and things like that. I'm sure you guys have heard of that. But what I do is I wet it, like I keep a little bowl of water whenever I'm working with it. I wet my finger, put some of it down, and smooth it out with your finger. It's gonna seal it out nice, and it'll hide any of your little mistakes. So here's an example. So this is when I was just learning to work with EVA, and so I was trying to make it cover that little corner, and you can see that big ugly crack in the middle. Well, I filled it with a bunch of quick seal, and then I smoothed it out with my finger, and it was nice and smooth. You can sand that afterwards as well. And so then here's some more on foamies. Again, it's a craft EVA foam, essentially. It's super thin, it's rippable. I personally don't use it a ton just because it is kind of weaker, but if you want to test things out, it's great for that. So here's some more on liquid foam. My favorite liquid foam is Flex Foam It from Smooth On. There's a bunch of different kinds. I believe I use Flex Foam It 3, so that expands the most. And so I want to say that expands 15 times the original volume, which is why it's so good. But it's easy to mix and pour into silicone molds. You always want to make sure you're using a mold release with that though, because it can adhere to whatever surface you're mixing with. It's good for fursuit parts and cosplay. So now some more on insulation foam. Again, it's very brittle and it's dentable. So if you took your nail and you press it into it, it's not going to bounce back. It can be cut again with an X-Acto blade, and it can be sanded. But one of the main downsides about it is if you're ever using Worbla and insulation foam together, insulation foam will melt with heat. So you have to be very careful because that is toxic. So you do not want to do that because the gas that comes off is not good for you. And so here's a foam sword that I made. I think I made that in 2015, so it's been a while, but you can see that I made it out of insulation foam, I covered it in Worbla, and then you can see the finished product there. So now we'll get into some mold making basics. See, who has made a mold before? Anyone? Yeah, at least we've got a couple, that's pretty good. So, one of the main types of molds that people use when you're working with fursuit heads is a slush or painted mold. So that's essentially a type of mold that the silicone is going to be pretty thick, You don't want thin, runny silicone because it's going to run directly off your head or whatever you're casting. So you can get thickeners for silicone and things like that that makes it kind of almost more like a putty that you're going to slap onto the mold versus it running down. So again, essentially a slush or painted mold is you're going to have your clay or fursuit head sculpt, cover it in silicone. I usually do like 2 to 3 layers. Then you're going to make a plaster outer cast of that head, and then you'll peel it all off. And so that plaster cast is very important because it gives the thin, flexible mold a shape. Another very common type of mold is like a brick. That's what I call it, a brick or a solid mold. So generally, that's like a chunk of silicone that an item comes out of. And so I use that, for my resin or silicone noses, things like that, or my hooves. You can see the clay fursuit feet that I've sculpted there that I use that for. So that's kind of your easier to use mold, but I usually just make a cardboard box, put my item in it, pour my silicone over it. And then this is kind of one of your more advanced tools that really makes or breaks your silicone molds, is I use a degasser or a pressure pot. So that's going to essentially suck all of the air out of your silicone, removing any bubbles. You can also use that with a slow cure time resin. So for realistic heads, people have the resin eyes. Generally, that resin is probably a 24 to 48 hour resin. And what I mean by that is it takes 24 to 48 hours to cure and become solid. And so a degasser or pressure pot is perfect for that because it's going to suck all the bubbles out. The resin isn't going to cure in the 5 minutes that you're degassing. You can pour it into your mold and it'll be perfectly crystal clear. No bubbles. Right? So then mold materials, I kind of mentioned plaster previously, but the 2 main mold materials is either plaster molds or silicone molds. Plaster molds are great when you're making a silicone item. For example, a silicone fursuit mold, or rather nose, you're not going to want to use a silicone mold because the silicone is going to adhere to itself when you try to pull that nose. So I use a plaster mold for that. So some of my favorite mold making materials is Dragon Skin 10, again from Smooth On. It's great for brick or solid molds. I've also used that for slush cast molds in the past. I also use Dragon Skin 10 for my outcome material, for my fursuit noses. If I ever do a silicone one, that's going to be made out of Dragon Skin 10. I also use Smooth Cast for resin. I believe I used Smooth Cast either 25 or 30. I think 25 it cures clear and 30 cures opaque white. Could be giving you wrong information on that, but either way, bless you. Those items work the same. Flex Foam It I use for my foam. Again, I believe I use 3. That's the one that expands the most. And then Plaster Paris is just plaster that I use. So some of my other favorite, I realize now what I did. Those are my favorite mold making materials. That's to make your molds. And then some of my favorite casting materials are Smooth On products like Dragon Skin 10, Smooth Cast 325. I think I was meaning to say 325 and 300. I believe 300 is the opaque white one. But 325 I do know can dye, and that'll be a color in the end. Flex Foam It, Easy Cast for clear or resin molds. So again, if you're doing resin fursuit eyes, I like Easy Cast because that's pretty crystal clear. And so here's some more mold and casting examples. So you can see I've got Lotus's nose. Her nose is a foam mold that I used. I used to mold my fursuit eyes. I currently 3D print them. And then there's some of my hooves up there as well. So now we're getting into patterning. Who's patterned something before? So most of you, that's pretty good. So patterning, there's a dozen ways to do it, but this is my favorite way. So again, I'm sure all of you, for the most part, have heard about a duct tape dummy. So what a duct tape dummy is that's a pattern of your entire body. So it's a lot easier for fursuit makers or yourselves to pattern a fursuit off, your physical form versus 1,000 measurements of your wrist and your ankle and all that stuff. So I actually have a duct tape dummy tutorial up on my YouTube, which is at Cosmo Cosplay, like all my other stuff, and I'll have my social media here at the end. But I always recommend checking out that video because I go over all of the information on making your duct tape dummy, and that's the info that helps me out the most. And so another way that you can do like patterning basics, for example, we're going to go back, you see that fursuit head there, you cover whatever you're working with duct tape, and then you're going to draw your pattern on and then cut the individual pieces off. That's my favorite way of patterning. It kind of gives you a hands-on feel, and then you're not just like drawing on paper and hoping it comes out right. Think of like patterning something is pulling the layer off it and then laying it flat, so then when you sew your pieces back together, it'll retain shape and go on to whatever you're patterning. So I always highly recommend testing your patterns. I like to test on like a scrap material, like I mentioned fleece or things like that. For some patterns, you can sketch on paper first. Like for my fursuit ears, for example, I always draw that out, hold it on the head, see how it looks, and then move on to foam versus going straight to the foam or things like that. You can see our lovely painter's suit DTD man up there. But for some patterning tips, for duct tape dummies, I always say wear a painter's suit because then you're not going to get duct tape on your skin or your clothes. And then you can cut that right off you when you're done, and then the painter's suit will be destroyed, but will be part of your duct tape dummy. Again, to pattern objects out of your mind, I always recommend sketching it out and then taking it off and see how that looks before going straight to fabric. Oopsies. And then here's my duct tape dummy tutorial. So if you want to scan that QR code, go ahead or take a picture of that. Again, it is right up on my YouTube, so that's great. I highly recommend that one. For darts, does anyone know what a dart is when sewing? Yeah, so most of you. So darts are essentially used when you're patterning something that isn't completely flat. So for example here, if we were patterning this cup, I wouldn't be able to lay the pattern completely flat, because the cup is curved. So you'd want to put darts or cuts in your fabric that are going to be sewn up and make a curve within your fabric. I always say make sure you mark lines clearly and draw registration marks. Registration marks are essentially marks on your pattern that that you're going to transfer to the fabric, that when you're sewing it together, those two dots or lines have to meet together. This guarantees your pattern isn't being pulled one way or isn't going to sew wonky. So darts are kind of hard to explain when it's not hands-on as well, so I recommend checking out other YouTube videos. And now safety. Safety is, in my opinion, the most important part of this panel. You only have one body, so we gotta keep it intact. Make sure you protect your eyes, your skin, your respiratory system. You don't want to be breathing in any fumes or things like that. Just some general basics. When you're cutting with an X-Acto blade, always cut away from your body. And that comes from someone who has accidentally cut myself with an X-Acto blade before. I'm up here telling you guys this panel, but I have made that mistake, and so you do not want to do that. Incredibly painful. So make sure, again, you're cutting away from your body, wear a mask when you can, safety gloves if you are doing something a little dangerous, whether that's plastic gloves for working with resin, or heat-resistant gloves to work with Warbler. And that was about it. So I do have a Patreon, so if you want to check that out, I put all of my behind the scenes on there. My website, which I want to start doing some vlogs, but I will also be putting this video up on my YouTube in case I missed anything. And then my social links are all at Cosmo Cosplay, pretty simple. I also have business cards in the back by the water coolers if anyone's interested. And now we can do a little Q&A if anyone has any questions that I glazed over. Yeah?
I was kind of zoned out, but I have these pretty chunky glasses. How easy is it to wear a fursuit with them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So whenever I'm making a fursuit that I plan to put glasses in, when I'm making my bucket head, I essentially just put more room within the glasses area. So when you're padding it, you maybe want to stick to padding just your forehead and maybe lower on the cheeks, things like that. And it's always kind of one of those things that you really want to try it on a bunch while you're making it. So you can see if your glasses fit. I was lucky, and I normally just took my glasses off whenever I fursuited because my script wasn't that bad, but I recently learned that even with Lotus's head, I didn't intend for her to fit with glasses, but she does. So sometimes you just luck out on spacing, but I always say give yourself extra room around the eyes, especially in the early foam stages. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have any
mean the neck? Yeah, so what I always did is for my first neck, I put my foam head on and I put saran wrap on my shoulders and down my front. And I actually had a friend, it's easier if you have someone to do it for you, but I patterned directly from the fursuit where the foam ended down my neck and down like the side, and I kept that pattern. And so what I essentially do is I reuse that pattern for every suit. They all lay nicely, on your normal set of shoulders. And so, again, I would just saran wrap and then tape it down, because then you're going to be able to get like a perfect form of your front, I guess you could say. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah. That's a great question. So what would you recommend if you don't have access to a 3D printer for eyes? I know in the past I've used, it sounds so funny to say it like this, but these circular plastic cups. I believe they're paint cups. I got them at Michael's. And so what I would do is they were like the perfect domed fursuit eye shape. So I would cut out the center, so you get your area for your iris and things like that. And then I would use those. So those have worked for me. I don't recommend things like foamies for the eyes, just because those can warp. And once your eye warps, it doesn't really go back. But I would recommend that. Or if you wanted to get some pre-made fursuit eyes, I know there's a bunch of people that sell them on Etsy and things like that. So if you don't have access to a 3D printer, you can either DIY it with again some plastic cups, or buy them pre-made, things like that. Yeah? Yeah, so what kind of mesh is used for your fursuit eyes? I use a type of buckram. So essentially, I should have listed the exact one that I use in this, but I found it on Amazon. Initially, I used to get it from Michael's and things like that, but what buckram is essentially, it's a mesh material, obviously, that has so many holes and things like that. Mine is more plasticky, and I like that more than the thinner fabric ones, just because the thinner fabric ones, in my opinion, are too loose and they don't hold enough shape. Whereas a thicker plastic one, it's not going to sag with time and things like that. I recommend going to Michael's or Joann Fabrics. They will have it there in person. It's usually in a bag of it rolled up, and so you can always feel them and look at the hole sizing. I could not tell you what the hole sizing is on her eyes, but it's pretty small. And so you'd think, oh, I need bigger holes in my fursuit eyes. I can't see through it. Or rather, you think that you can. But when it's up close, you can pretty much see directly through it. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but I would check at Joann's or Michael's and look in person there. Yep.
What would be the best steps to make TV wings?
Oh, to make, could you repeat that one more time?
Small wings.
Small wings, yeah, that's a great question. Here, I'm gonna jump through my slides real quick. I know I have an example in here. My wings, I made them out of minky and fur, but I sewed them actually directly on, here we go. So the wings themselves, the feathery parts, I sewed those directly on 1/2-inch foam. So essentially what I did is I made my wing pattern, I sewed my 2 pieces of fabric together, I glued one side of the feather to the foam, I flipped it inside out, which is the tricky part, and then I sewed, the crease lines to define each individual feather on that way. So I would use, again, just upholstery fursuit foam. I used 1/2-inch because that worked for me, but I've seen people, use a little bit more, a little bit less. You could also use a batting. Batting is essentially a thicker fabric that's usually used for quilts, but you can also get that at Joann's or online. Great question, thank you. Let me hop through here real quick. Almost there. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Do you use a headgear inside to keep it on your head?
That's a great question. So I use the bucket tutorial for my fursuit heads. So if you Google that, there's a ton of tutorials on that. That's kind of why I didn't include it here. But essentially, I make a foam bucket that is the same measurement as my head. So you're going to want to measure your head around your crown. So for example, mine is 23 inches, and then the front of your face, I believe mine is 8 inches. So then I'll cut out a 23-inch by 8-inch rectangle of foam, glue it together so you've got like a tube. Then I glue on like a top curve and like the sides, and that kind of guarantees that it sits snugly on your head. It isn't gonna, fall off and things like that. So it'll cover the back of your head and, the front of your forehead and or your cheeks. So that kind of holds it on for you. Yeah, great question. And any other questions? Yeah.
Going back to the games, is there any tips for attaching them to the fursuits
Yeah, that's a great question. I've seen some people put like metal rods in their wings to kind of give them shape and keep them in place. I've done that before. I've also seen people with their fursuit has an individual back plate that the wings can come off of, and then so essentially you'd be putting on like a backpack that has a back plate in it, putting on your fursuit maybe over it, and then attaching the wings that way, if they're bigger wings or things like that. I know in the past I've sewn my wings directly into the backs of my fursuits because they were smaller, but for bigger ones I tend to make those detachable. I've also done zippers in the past so the wings will zip off. Like Costello up here on my sign, the puffin, his wings, they actually zip off and around the arms, so they're individual arm sleeves. That way he can wash the bodysuit in the washing machine, whatever, and the wings won't get damaged. But his wings were already pretty sturdy, and maybe instead of using upholstery foam, you could use an EVA or something like that. Something that's going to keep it a little more stiff than a thinner upholstery foam. Any other questions? And if not, y'all are free to go, because I've had a great time. Again, thank you so much for coming to my panel.